And where was he from?
He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but he had lived in a lot of states for the reason that his father was a telegraph operator for the railroad, and they were continually being moved westward as the railroad went west.
Which railroad did he work for?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I
Who
really-
was your grandfather?
My grandfather was David Davis.
Now, he was a telegraph operator.
He was a telegraph operator for the railroad.
Did you know him?
No, he was dead years before I was born.
Who was your mother?
My mother was Emily Johnson from Sweden.
How did your parents meet?
My mother was left a widow at Cripple Creek, Colorado in about 1903. She had a small daughter, and my mother worked in a daycare center and kept this little girl. Well, by that time, my father's first wife had died and left a small child, a little girl. And he kept his little girl in this daycare center, and that's how they met. My mother was working there, and he brought the little girl every morning and then came and got her in the evening. And
They
that's-
had daycare centers back then.
Well, they surely did. I don't know what they call them. Day nurseries or daycare centers. Anyway, it's a place they kept these children. And
Oh.
that was, what's the town close to Cripple Creek? Oh gosh, it's just 6 miles down from Cripple Creek in the mining country.
I've been to Cripple Creek, but
Well, I was there last fall. What's the name of the town? Anyway, that's where they met.
yeah.
And then they came to Oklahoma. They married in 1907, and they came to Oklahoma about a year later.
How come they came to Oklahoma?
Well, my dad had lived here in the late 1900s for a short time. In fact, when he enlisted in the Spanish-American War, he lived at Wagoner, Oklahoma, or close to Wagoner. And in the roster of Rough Riders, he is listed as being from Wagoner, IT, Indian Territory.
What made him decide to enlist in?
In the Spanish-American War? Well, two things, I would say. He never spelled it out. One thing, my father was very patriotic. He might have been a little bit naive. He thought, if the country needs you, why, you owed it to your country. And it might have been a little bit of the desire for adventure, I don't know. But anyway, of course, that was an all-volunteer group. And he had a great admiration for Teddy Roosevelt.
I was going to ask, was he recruited by Roosevelt, or how did he actually join the Rough Riders?
Well, I don't know that part, but I think Teddy Roosevelt played a big part of it. And during the war, of course, he personally came to know Teddy Roosevelt. And as long as he lived, he was a great admirer of Teddy Roosevelt.
Did he ever talk about his experiences with Roosevelt
Yes.
in the Rough? What did he say about the Rough Riders?
Well, he used to say that the Rough Riders were kind of a motley group. He said they had cowboys, Indians, outlaws, and a few millionaires. Not many, but they had Hamilton Fish from New York.
Now, was Roosevelt the originator of the Rough Riders?
Well, I think it was his idea. Now, I can't vouch for that. I haven't done any research into it, but Roosevelt was certainly the dominant figure in it, and he personally was out there stirring around with those men. And my father told me one time that he was associated with Roosevelt closely enough to get a reprimand from him one time because Roosevelt told him and another boy, young man, to crawl down a certain ditch and do something. And he said when they started crawling down through there, the rocks were so sharp in the bottom of the ditch that it peeled up their legs. So instead of crawling, they hunkered and ran, and said just as soon as they raised up, why the Spanish began shelling them, and he said that rated a reprimand from Roosevelt. He reminded them they were told to crawl, not run.
Was this in Cuba?
That was in Cuba.
Did Roosevelt personally come to Oklahoma to recruit?
Now that I don't know. I know that Roosevelt personally came to Oklahoma in, I believe, 1901 when they had the reunion of the Rough Riders at Oklahoma City. He was here.
Was your father in the reunion?
Yes. And he said they were entertained by Will Rogers and Lucille Mulhall, who rode horses around on the steps of buildings.
Was that before or after he became president?
Roosevelt?
Yeah.
That was before, I think.
That was before.
1901. Now, I'm not sure.
Now, he became president in 1901. That's when McKinley was assassinated.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, now that reunion was, I'm pretty sure, in 1901. Now, McKinley was the president when the Rough Riders came back from Cuba, because I remember my dad telling about when they landed in New York, they passed in review before McKinley, and he said some of them decided to show out a little, and they kicked their horses in the ribs and, you know, did a little bit of Wild West stuff on the streets of New York. And he said they whipped around a corner there showing off, and there was a whole bunch of telegraph poles piled up around that corner that they didn't know about. And he said the horses had to leap over the poles or else just stack up there. But he said luckily they were pretty well trained in jumping, so everybody cleared it all right. But the way I got it, a bunch of these fellas were just going to show the New Yorkers what Rough Riders they really were.
Were all the Rough Riders from this part of the country?
Well, I think, no, not all of them, but he was in Troop L. And I think Troop L was from this area right in here, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and maybe a few from Arizona, I'm not sure. Now, up at the college, they have a book on the Rough Riders, and it has a roster of the Rough Riders, and I found his name in it as a member of Troop L. So
he was in Troop L. How many troops were in the?
I don't know. I just know that he was in Troop L.
Did you ever read or hear of why Roosevelt wanted the Rough Riders?
Well, I don't know why, unless it was because at that time, really, the swiftest way to get any place was on the horse, wasn't it? And especially in the jungles of Cuba, I can't see any motorized vehicle getting around in Cuba. Can you?
No.
He said that even their bigger guns were mounted on the backs of mules. He said they shot right over the ears of mules with those guns that they had. You know, kind of a saddle-like thing on a mule's back, and then the gun mounted on that. And he said they'd fire right up over the ears of those mules, and they wouldn't even wiggle their ears.
What else did your father talk about being in Cuba? And any more other stories about?
Well, he talked about what poor condition those natives were in. He's talking about they were so thin that you could see their ribs sticking out. And he got the idea, maybe that was a part of the propaganda of the day, that they had been terribly mistreated by the ruling forces, which at that time were the Spanish. Anyway, he thought that the natives, well, he thought they were pitiful looking. He's talking about they'd come into camp at night and beg food, and the food they had was hardtack and dried beef, and they must have been pretty hungry. He's telling about loading down some of those kids with that hardtack and dried beef when they'd come around there at night and beg food. And the way I understand it, compared with modern times, the food was very poor quality. I don't know what hardtack is.
It's a mixture of flour and water and little salt, I think.
And dried out,
Yeah.
And then he said they had dried beef, which I guess is something like Indian jerky.
Yeah. Did your father go up San Juan Hill?
Yes,
Did he tell about that?
yes. He told about San Juan Hill, and I remember asking him about that because an old man told me one time that when they went up San Juan Hill, they put the Negro Regiment in the lead. And I asked my dad specifically about it, and he said, no, there weren't any Negroes ahead of him. And he told about Hobson's trying to bottle up the Spanish fleet in the harbor there. And I remember coming home from school, and I told about how Hobson bottled up the fleet and so on in the harbor at, what was Santiago or Havana? Which was it?
I'm not sure. I'm thinking Havana, but I'm not sure.
Might have been
I think
Havana. Well, anyway, I came home from school telling about how he bottled up the fleet and what a clever trick that was. And my dad says, oh, but he didn't get them bottled up. Said he tried to, but some way in the current, the ship floated around so that the Spanish could get around it. I said, oh, no, that's not what the book said. And I remember what he said. He said, but I was there. I was trying to tell him what the book said about Hobson, and he told me he was there and he knew that wasn't right.
Mm-hmm. What was it like going up San Juan Hill? Did he talk about that?
Well, not a lot. I get the idea, though, that was one of the rough battles of the war.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't talk much about the blood and gore of the war. He told more about the funny little incidents, like the jungles were so thick down there, and he said some of the soldiers would just shoot at random into the top of the trees, just pepper the trees. And he's telling about how those Cubans would sail out of there. You know, they was afraid they was going to get shot, and all the boys were doing was just having fun, and just see them bail out. And he told about how those Cubans could climb a tree as fast as anybody could run, you know, just by taking hold of it and just walking up it. Just like, you know, you rappel on a mountain with a rope, you just walk down it. He's telling about that's the way they could climb trees, too.
Now, who were the Cubans fighting for?
The Cubans, well, the way I understand it, I don't remember that he told that they took much part in it either way.
Mm-hmm. He probably could care less, I guess.
Well, it's just sort of the bystanders, sort of like the Vietnamese were in the war in Vietnam. They pedaled around on bicycles.
What's your favorite story your father told you about the war?
My favorite story? He used to tell about the yellow fever and the malaria. I think that was the big plague of the war, because he was hospitalized, if you could call it a hospital, with malaria, but he left. He wouldn't stay there because he said those yellow fever patients were so delirious that you couldn't sleep around them, because they had a tendency just to rove around and get in bed with you and mumble and so on till you couldn't get any rest around them. And then he told something that strikes me as rather strange now. He said when they got ready to leave Cuba, everybody that could stand on his feet at all intended to leave. They didn't want to get left there, and he said some of these guys had yellow fever and were so sick they could hardly stand up. But if they could stand in line long enough to pass inspection, they could load on the ship and leave. And he's telling me about that he had a friend that had yellow fever, and they knew he had yellow fever. And the guy stood next to my dad when they were in line for inspection before they went on the ship. And my dad said he was so weak he couldn't hold his pack. And what happened, my dad held on to the pack till just before the inspection officer got to them, and then they slipped it over on the other guy's back, and he stood there till inspector got by, and then my dad had to load his pack on the boat for him, and he didn't get up anymore till they got to New York. And he also told about some of those guys being such fatalists. They'd get it in their head that they were going to die on a certain day. They didn't feel lucky. You know, they were, I guess you'd call them superstitious. And he was telling about one fellow that had yellow fever and managed to get on the boat. Of course, when they got to New York then, they quarantined them because they were so sick, and they had a better way of finding out by then that the guys were sick. But the thing was, these fellas didn't want to get left in Cuba. They wanted to get to New York. They didn't mind being hospitalized in New York, but my dad told about one fellow that just emptied his pockets, money and all, and gave it to my dad and said, if I live over it, I'll get in touch with you. And he said months afterwards he heard from the fellow, and he sent him his money and his few personal possessions, but the fellow had it in his head that he just wasn't going to get over this yellow fever, but he did. But I'm thinking about they didn't do much inspection, or they wouldn't have let those fellas out of there with yellow fever. Well, my dad got out with a bad case of malaria, and when he got to the States again, they had the idea then the way to get over malaria was go west. And my dad went to Wyoming and herded sheep and worked out there a few years. And apparently they didn't have any really good way to treat malaria.
Not really, apparently not. How come he went to Cripple Creek?
Well, by that time...
when did he go to Cripple Creek? What year?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the year that he went to Cripple Creek. Victor's that town I was trying to think of a while ago, the mining town that's 6 miles from Cripple Creek. I found his name in a directory that was, I believe, a 1906 directory. And I found it in the museum at Cripple Creek. What I found it in, well, it was a city directory, and they had the directory for Goldfield, Victor, and Cripple Creek, which were just adjacent mining towns out there. And my mother and dad were married at Victor. They were married at Goldfield, which is really just a suburb of Victor. And I knew they were living there in 1907, in March of 1907, when they were married. So I looked in the 1906 directory for Goldfield, and I found my dad's name and his brother's name. And how much farther back they were there, I don't know.
Did he talk about working the gold fields?
What he worked in the gold mines.
How did he work the mines?
Well, he did what they call leasing. And I don't know all the terms of a leasing agreement, but the way I understand it, you lease a certain area of the mine, and if you are lucky and get a lot of pay dirt, as they call it, well, you get good money, and it may be you work for nothing. In other words, you're not on wages.
Who did he work for? What company? Or
I don't know. I've heard him talk about the Portland mine and the Coeur d'Alene mine and different ones, but I don't know which ones he worked.
now, did he actually go in the mine shafts?
Yes. Yeah.
Did he talk about being inside the mine?
Yes.
What was it like in there?
Well, I don't know. I'd think it'd be kind of scary if I had to go down crouching under there working in those holes in the ground, because I suffer from claustrophobia. My mother said what she remembered about work at the mine was when those sirens would blow and they'd know there'd been a cave-in or some kind of trouble in the mine, and she said everybody in town went rushing to the entrance to the mine to find out who was missing and all that stuff she's talking about. the tension there. Another thing that was scary, I think, in that part of Colorado was the mud slides and the snow slides in the spring when the snow and the mud started sliding down the mountains. We saw a place last fall in Colorado where several houses had been covered with a mudslide. That was at Twin Lakes, I believe, on the way to Aspen. But she said that was an ever-present fear with the people at certain seasons of the year. Some of that snow and mud would come sliding down the mountains.
What kind of house did they live in Colorado?
Oh, I don't know. I just don't know.
Oh, I was going to ask, did Roosevelt come to Wagoner to recruit?
I doubt it, but I don't know. I don't even know where my dad went to sign up. I don't know whether it was Wagoner or where it was.
You know, in San Antonio, there is a city park called Roosevelt Park.
Well, he trained the Rough Riders in one area of San Antonio.
Okay, Roosevelt Park is the park where they trained. That's why it's called Roosevelt Park.
Yeah.
Did he talk about that area?
No, he didn't talk much about San Antonio, but he talked quite a bit about Tampa, Florida. See, that's where they embarked for Cuba, was at Tampa.
What did he say about Tampa?
Well, he's talking about those landlubbers trying their hand at swimming in the ocean. And he's talking about how funny it was. Some of those guys thought they were good swimmers, and he said those waves would be rolling in, and said you'd look and there'd be a guy scrambling in the top of the wave way up here, and then the wave would go down and he'd be in the bottom of it. But he talked more about their getting out and hunting alligator eggs. He said those fellas would scrounge around in the jungles there and try to find those alligator eggs and start digging them out, and alligators would come after them. And said these guys from this part of the country never had seen alligators. I think that made quite an impression on him.
I imagine.
And he told about training the horses. They had bought horses all over this country, I guess. And he said it was kind of an unwritten law that when you roped a horse, you were supposed to ride him. And he said it was a kind of a game that when you threw the rope, why, the fellas would try to booger the horses so the wrong horse would get his head in the noose. And said if you caught the wrong horse, why, you rode him anyway. And my dad told about getting in the awkward squad and staying in it for I don't know how long because he happened to get a crazy horse that he couldn't civilize. But he said that was a game with the boys to try to see that everybody got a bronc but himself.
And he was in the awkward squad?
He said he was in the awkward squad a while simply because he couldn't get his horse to be still. He said they'd get in position and they'd say ready, aim, fire, but when he got ready to fire, his horse would be up in there and he'd be trying to hang on, and he couldn't fire when he was supposed to. And he's telling about he'd fire late, and the commanding officer would say, "Who was that?" And he'd say he was. And they'd tell him to report to the awkward squad. And he said the whole thing was that it wasn't a matter he couldn't shoot, but he couldn't make his horse behave.
So the awkward squad were the one that couldn't get the horses to behave.
To cooperate, yeah. Yeah, and that was just kind of a game with those old boys, is try to get the other guy in Dutch on account of, there's some horses that are broncs, and always will be, and maybe that's the reason they got sold in the first place to the Army, was because they were hard to control, and he said they had some that were like that.
Overall, what did your father think about the Spanish-American War?
Well, I've been reading in late years that we question now the wisdom of the whole business. We wondered if we weren't sort of the victims of some propaganda, but I don't think my dad ever questioned the wisdom of it, and he certainly never questioned anything that Teddy Roosevelt did.
What was your father like? What kind of man was he?
soft-spoken, sort of quiet, reserved type. Now, he could tell a good yarn, but he wasn't the boisterous Irish type, if you know what I mean. Just before he died in the VA hospital at Muskogee. And just before he died, he located an Indian named Russell, who had been in the Spanish-American War with him. And there was a man living at Wagoner named Jack DeMitt, who was in the war with my dad. And Jack DeMitt had a bad leg. And I know they used to tell that Jack DeMitt got shot in the leg during the Spanish-American War because he and my dad were trying to hide behind the same tree, and the tree wasn't very big. Anyway, the shell got Jack DeMitt in the leg, and he always had a kind of a game leg after that.
Mm-hmm. How long was your father in the war?
Well, whatever time the war lasted, it was just a few months from the time they started till they stopped. And then, toward the end of the war, they started recruiting for the Philippines. He's telling about when they were still in Cuba that they came there and tried to recruit these Rough Riders for duty in the Philippines. That was when, was it Admiral Dewey
Yeah.
had that bunch in the Philippines? And he said some of them still wanted some more fighting, and they signed up to go to the Philippines, but my dad said he'd had all that hot weather fighting he wanted. The insects and the fever, I think the malaria discouraged him. You know, people feel so bad with
Oh, yeah.
malaria.
Did your father ever talk about Admiral Sampson?
No, don't remember. He talked about R.C. Day. I don't remember talking about Sampson.
Now, Sampson was the admiral in Cuba, where Perry was in the Philippines.
No, I don't remember he talked about that, but he talked about R.C. Day. And one thing that I thought was very strange, and it's entirely out of keeping with present day computer printouts and so on his discharge, it was filled out by hand, and then on the back of it was a personal note by his commanding officer, written in longhand, about what a good soldier he was. And I thought, well, my lands nowadays, when they run those discharges off like they run off Social Security checks, for an officer to take time to write a longhand note on a soldier's discharge was something. I remember seeing his old uniform.
Do you have it?
I don't have it, but when I was a kid, we had it at home. It was an old kind of dirty yellow tan, kind of waterproof stuff.
Yeah. Do you have any artifacts or items that belong to him that he used in the war?
No, I don't have. My brother has his discharge, I know that, but I don't know whatever became of his old uniform. I imagine that it was consigned to the trash eventually. After my dad died, my brother, the only boy in the family, was going to World War II, and my mother sold the farm down by Porter. That's where our home had been all these years, and all that old junk, that uniform and stuff was there. We had an upstairs bedroom that had everything that you thought you might someday want to look at. Anyway, when she had to leave there, I just have a feeling that all that old stuff was junked.
That hurts.
Where does your brother live?
Wagoner.
Because we'd like you to copy that discharge if we could.
my brother, he, do you know the town of Wagganer?
I've been there.
Well, I can give you his address. Walter Davis, Post Office Box 452, Wagoner, Oklahoma, 74467 is the zip.
Okay, do you have a phone number for him by any chance?
Yes. His phone is 918
Mm-hmm.
485
485
3779.
3779. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, if it's okay, we'll contact him and get a copy of the discharge
That's fine.
for the museum. Do you remember anything else your father told you about the war? Any stories or?
Oh, we used to, I know we kids would sit and listen to all those old tales about what happened. I remember he told about the bodies, about stacking them up like stove wood and then guarding them and then burying them with just a blanket around them and a bottle with their name and serial number and so on.
These were the Americans or the Spanish?
Those were the Americans.
The Americans?
See, they didn't have this reburial service then. They buried them in Cuba, and that's where they stayed, as far as I know.
I wonder if they're still there.
I guess. I never heard of them being moved.
I imagine they are. I don't think I've ever read or heard of any place where they moved them back to the States.
And I remember he told about some of them being buried at sea, you know, that died on the way over and back. I would think there'd be more die on the way back that
Yeah.
had
Well,
yellow fever and
yeah,
so on.
malaria, yeah. Did your father buy the farm down at Porter? Did he own the farm?
Yes.
And why did you say they decided to come to Oklahoma?
Well, my dad had been through here for a short time in the late 1890s, and he liked the country around Porter. And he had worked in the mines in Colorado, and he decided he wanted to get out on a farm somewhere. And he and my mother moved to this farm. It's 6 miles southwest of Porter. They moved in August from Colorado. And when they came in August, they couldn't get the house to live in. It was rented till the first of the year. And they pitched a tent. Imagine a tent in August in Oklahoma. Well, anyway, they lived in this tent, and my mother told about the neighborhood dogs would crawl under the tent and eat all the food in sight. In other words, you had to put it in something that the dogs couldn't get into. But my husband's people homesteaded down here between Carnegie and Apache in 1901, and they lived in a dugout.
What were their names?
Mickley.
What was his first name, your father-in-law?
He was J.T., Jesse T. Mickley, and he was from Ohio. But they lived in dugout, and they'd tell about how you had to get the skunks and the snakes and so on out of the dugout. So I guess living in a tent on the east side of the state wasn't much worse than living in a dugout in western Oklahoma.
Now, was that the lottery down here?
Yeah, my father-in-law drew this farm in the lottery at El Reno. And he said when they moved to that farm down close to Apache, that there was no road at all. They just took off across the grass. He said the last road they were on was when they crossed the river over here at, over there close to Gary. What's that place? Bridgeport. They crossed the river at Bridgeport, and he said that was the end of the road, and they just took off through the...
How'd they find their farm?
Well, that was the funny part about it. He and some school teacher that he knew had come down here to kind of look the situation over. And this school teacher was supposed to be the smart boy and show him from the land numbers where the place was. Well, when he actually filed for the homestead, he was 6 miles off. So the farm he actually drew was 6 miles from where he thought he was getting it because of a mix-up in land numbers. You know, it was marked off by townships and so on. Anyway, there was a mix-up in the numbers. He didn't get the farm that he thought he was getting, but he got one.
So, but then how did he get in a wagon and drive out to his farm? How did you actually locate the...
Well, now how he finally found it, I don't know. I think that they had markers on the corners, didn't they?
Yeah. Of course, I don't know how you find the markers, though.
Yeah, in the grass.
Yeah.
Because I remember hearing people talk about in the early days when they first homesteaded there. Now, some people that lived in his neighborhood down there said that one couple went to visit another couple late one evening, and they stayed till after dark. And when they started home with their lantern, they couldn't find their dugout. And they just walked in the grass all night because they couldn't find the place. You see, grass was so high then. And they said they just roamed all night and never did find their dugout till the next morning.
How tall was the grass back then?
Well, I've heard my mother-in-law talk about it being up on the side of a horse. You know, instead of being the little short grass, at that time they had the tall bunch grass too. Of course, that was the grass that was killed out first by the overgrazing. But I know she's telling about that the grass was high.
As a child, what chores did you do in the farm?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh my. We always had to milk cows and feed chickens and carry in wood and pump water. We didn't have a windmill till I was a teenager, so every drop of water somebody had to furnish the manpower.
You have a pump or a bucket?
We had a pump, but you know, you had to work the handle.
Oh, was it a pitcher pump or the outside?
No, it wasn't a pitcher pump. We had a deep well about 96 feet or so, and a pitcher pump wouldn't have worked on there. No, we had a deep well.
You have to prime the pump when you...
No, not that kind. We didn't. I've seen those pumps that had to be primed, but we didn't on that one.
How big was your farm?
We had 120 acres where we lived, and then my dad always leased some land besides that.
What kind of crops did you raise?
Well, raised cotton and corn, but his specialty was sweet potatoes. And he had a sweet potato curing house. And that was our big money crop.
How do you cure sweet potatoes?
Well, you dig them in October, and you keep the room quite warm for about 3 weeks until they're cured out or dried out. And then you just have to be careful that they don't freeze. So if you have any sub-zero temperature or really cold weather, you have to start a fire in the thing. But he had that curing house, and it would hold several hundred bushels, and he would keep them all winter and then sometimes ship them on the train in the spring. But they would sell them along during the winter to grocery stores and so on. But then in the spring, when he wanted to clear them out, why, he'd sometimes ship a whole bunch of them.
You ever chop cotton?
Oh, yeah, I've chopped lots of cotton, corn.
Tell me about chopping cotton.
Oh, it's a hot job, and it's a job that lasts all summer. I mean, you chop cotton.
I mean, exactly how do you chop it?
Well, in those days, they thought cotton had to be thinned out. You know, we used to think cotton had to be, the plants 18 inches apart or so. Now they just sew it and leave it like it happens to fall in the road. They don't thin it anymore. They don't do much of this chopping anymore either. They couldn't afford to. But we used to, we chopped it to thin it so that the plants wouldn't be too close together, and then, of course, get the weeds out of it too.
How much could you chop in a day?
Oh goodness, that depend on how weedy it was and so on. I have no idea. Not very much though.
How much could you pick in a day?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I never was a cotton picker. I couldn't pick over a couple of 100 pounds a day, but that was picking. That wasn't pulling the bowls and all. That was picking it out of the burrs.
Where was the gym?
At Porter.
Who ran the gym?
There was a C.N. Nunn had a gin at Porter, and C.N. Nunn was a man that was famous in agriculture circles in Oklahoma, and he was killed by a couple of thugs in the 1930s, was shot and died a couple of days later. And then there was a Laney had a gin at Porter. Every little old crossroads town had a gin. There was a gin at Redbird. Do you know what Redbird is?
Redbird. I've been to Red Oak, but not Redbird.
Redbird is a Negro town up the railroad track from Porter toward Tulsa. It's one of the famous Negro towns of, you know, it's sort of like Boley and Taft.
How big was Porter when you were a child?
About the size it is now. I imagine about 500-600 people.
What did the town look like? Can you just describe the...
Oh, it was an old town then, and it's old now. They have a few new homes there, not a lot. But it's turned into a coal mining town now. They're just tunneling up the whole country around there.
The strip mining or actually tunnels?
Strip.
Mining. Yeah. How about Wagner? When's the first time you went to Wagner?
Oh, I was a very small child when I first went to Wagner because that's where we used to have our track meets. And every spring, our little old country school would go to Wagner and jump and hop and do all those things and try to outdo somebody else's little old country school. Anyway, that's where they had the contest.
What was your first impression when you saw Wagner the first time?
What I remembered about Wagner, the first time I ever remembered going there was the city park. And I wondered why the trees grew in such straight lines, because they didn't grow in straight lines along the creeks at home.
How big was Wagner?
How big is it now?
Well, back then.
I would guess 2,000 or 3,000, but I don't know.
The streets paved?
Yes. But I can remember when streets weren't paved in Haskell and Porter. I can remember when there wasn't a paved road from Tulsa to Oklahoma City. First time I ever went to Oklahoma City was to Jack Walton's barbecue. And there was not an all-paved road to Oklahoma City,
What year was that?
1923.
Did you meet Jack Walton?
Well, I didn't shake his hand, but I certainly saw him. I was in the Senate chamber when he was sworn in as governor.
How come they removed him?
I don't know. I think he kind of squabbled with the wrong people. You know, he went in with a bang, all that big barbecue and all that stuff. And then in just a few months, they were down on him, you know. He called out the militia and so on. I really don't know. And that's when they were squabbling over the Ku Klux Klan, and I really don't know. If you ask people why they really kicked him out, I don't know.
How come you went to the barbecue?
Well, my dad was a Republican. Jack Walton was a Democrat. And I don't think my dad would have walked across the street to see Jack Walton. But my older sister had married into a family of Georgia Democrats. And her father-in-law came along and says, why don't we all go to the barbecue and the inauguration and so on. So we rented a 7-passenger Page car and drove over those dirt roads to the swearing-in ceremonies. Well, now the barbecue. There's one little hitch about the barbecue. None of us got any barbecue because after the inauguration and everybody was ready to eat it, it was still raw. You couldn't eat it. And I don't know who finally got all the barbecue because they had long trenches, just rows and rows of trenches. And that meat on racks over those trenches, but they just didn't start it soon enough, or somebody made a miscue. Anyway, it wasn't ready to eat. So I didn't see them serve any of it. But what I remembered about that swearing-in ceremony for Jack Walton was, we were in the gallery, and they were swearing him in on the floor of the Senate down below. It was so crowded up there that if you got your hand up, you couldn't bring it down, and if you got it down, you couldn't raise it. And some women passed out up there, and I can see why they did, because they were smoking down below in the Senate chamber, and that old rank cigar smoke was floating around up at the top. And the air was so, well, poor. There's so many people jammed in there till it was positively a fire hazard. But anyway, some women just passed out, and they were passing those women over the head of the people. They absolutely picked them up and just shoved them over the top of people's heads to get them out. That's the only way they could get them out. That was the awfulest mess you ever saw in your life. Talking about being a sardine. That's what I remember about it. And something else I remember about it was pretty close to the Capitol there was the old, tall, dead horseweeds. They had evidently failed to do much mowing around there, and I know those old, that was January, and the old dead weeds were still standing there.
Mm-hmm. Did you do the laundry at home as a child?
I helped. We all did.
How'd you do it?
We did it on a rub board. We had an old black kettle in the backyard, and we'd build a fire under that old black kettle and heat the water, and then we'd did you ever see a rub board?
Yes, I sure have.
You know what they are then.
Yes.
Well, anyway, that's the way we did it until my mother got a gasoline-powered Maytag when, I don't know, that's 30s or 40s. But when I was a small child, we rubbed clothes on a rub board.
What about the ironing?
Ironing? You build a fire in the stove and put those old irons on the stove and let them get hot. And you had a handle that you'd put on them, and then you'd start ironing, and when you started, it'd be too hot, and in 2 or 3 minutes it was too cold, and you'd have to go back and get a different iron. But I can remember when we had electric irons with no regulators on them, and you had to watch out or you'd burn a hole in things. Do you remember those? You don't, do you?
No, I don't remember those.
Well, the first electric irons had no thermostats on them. They just run wild.
Huh.
But the funniest thing was we had some electric curling irons, and that was when I was a student at OSU, only then it was A&M College. And we weren't supposed to even have curling irons, any electrical stuff there. But we had some electric curling irons, and a girl borrowed them, and that was the kind that had no thermostat, and they'd get red hot, and she got that thing tangled up in the back of her hair, and it just burned all the hair out. She couldn't get it loose, and it was red hot, and I remember that hair just smoking and fried.
Why didn't she unplug it? I guess she didn't think of that.
I guess when it got on fire, it's hard to think about unplugging.
Oh no.
Was that at A&M?
I was at A&M.
When'd you go there?
I went there in the fall of 1927.
1927.
Uh-huh.
Do you live on campus?
Yeah, part of the time. Part of the time I worked and lived off campus.
Which dorm did you live in, or you were in a sorority?
It was later called Gardner Hall. When we went there, it was called the Woman's Building, and it was the old dormitory, and some people would call it the Old Woman's Building.
What was the inside of Gardner Hall like?
What was it like?
Yeah, the inside of it.
Very bare and plain. Mattresses were about that thick, and the floors were old and no floor covering on. And just the very barest.
How many women to a room?
2 for, I don't know of any, well, they had a few single rooms, and I did at one time stay in a single room when I was there in summer school. But most of them had 2 to a room. And the bathrooms, they just have one bathroom unit for each wing. You know, this floor on the west end had a bathroom. You didn't have a bathroom with your bedroom then. You went down the hall and around the corner and so on to the bathroom.
How was your room decorated?
Didn't have any decoration.
Besides the bed, what'd you have?
A very plain dresser and a chair or 2, sort of like a jail cell.
Ooh.
It was very plain. But you know what it cost us a semester?
How much?
I think it was $19 a semester. I want to tell you something. When I went to Stillwater, my enrollment fees came to $17 and something. $17 and so many cents. My books cost $17 and something. I took chemistry, so I had to pay a lab fee. I had to pay that Redskin fee. You know, everybody's supposed to take the Redskin. And the Old Collegian. And I took 18 hours of college work, and all of it, the enrollment fee was $17 and something for the semester. And all my books, including my chemistry book and my chemistry lab book and so on, everything I had to buy was $17 and something for books. Now, I remember that because it's practically the same amount.
Did you have a cafeteria in the dormitory?
No. Well, on the campus at that time, they had a cafeteria that was just a building by itself.
Where was it located?
It was located west of Morrill Hall. Do you know where Morrill Hall?
That's right next to Gardner Hall.
Yeah, and then on west there was the cafeteria.
Okay. That's the building, I couldn't think the name of it. right across from Old Central.
The one they tore down?
No, the one they're redoing it.
Oh, the one they're working on, one that, oh, okay.
Memorial Hall has the columns. and
Yeah.
the
Had all the
Yeah.
steps.
Yeah, oh, yeah, right,
The
yeah,
one I couldn't think the name of.
Right,
started in the
yeah,
hall.
okay,
The old
okay.
women's building.
okay, yeah,
It's right across from Old Central there.
okay.
So they've restored Old Central.
It's,
museum.
used to be an auditorium just south of it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that campus has changed. I went back a few years ago when Edmund Lowe retired. I went up there. They had the state library convention there, and I was there for the
Now,
convention.
who's Edmund Lowe?
Edmund Lowe was head of the college library at Stillwater for years and years and years. Well, anyway, he and I were walking around over the campus, and he is showing me this and that, and I couldn't get my bearings straight. I told him I thought there used to be a highway came down through there. And he said there was. And he was the one that had that highway closed. In fact, where the college library is now, it's just about sitting across where the highway used to come down from Perry and up that way. And he said he found out it's a whole lot harder to close the highway than it is to get it built in the first place. We used to have to cross the highway going from the dormitory out to Whitehurst Hall.
I didn't know there was a highway there.
Well, there used to be.
Yeah. So I went to school there, 64 and 65.
Uh-huh. Well, this was way back
Yeah.
when it looked different.
What'd you major in?
I majored in elementary education, and then I switched to high school education. But most of my, and then I went to OU and was in the School of Library Science there.
Was Dr. Bazell with OU at that time?
No. George Cross was the
Oh,
president
George
when I
Cross,
went there.
okay.
Mhm.
He's still in Norman.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Well, when did you start to school? First grade.
When did I start school?
When and where?
I started to school at a country school, a one-room school called Spring Hill, out from Porter, about 6 miles, close to my home. And I started in the fall of 1960, because I wasn't 6 years old yet. I was 6 the 1st of December, but I started early in the, maybe summer. They used to have summer school.
Who was your teacher?
C.M. Gilmore, who later moved to Michigan.
Is that a man?
Yeah.
Do you remember in the first, second, and third grades, did you do any work in school for the war effort in World War I?
In World War I remember that the women of the neighborhood had knitting projects. They knitted those sweaters for soldiers. Actually, what they were, they just knit a piece about that long and then fold it over and leave a hole here for the arms. They were sleeveless sweaters is what they were. And I remembered they brought material to school and cut it out and sent it home by the kids for their parents, for their mothers to make, and that was supposed to be for some overseas bunch, Armenians or something. I don't know what. What I remember about World War I was we had a school teacher that was in love with some guy that was in the war, and she had us singing those old war songs all the time. About once I had a sweetheart, noble, brave, and true, and all that stuff, those gushy ones.
Where'd you go to high school?
Porter.
Porter?
Mm-hmm.
In your elementary years, what kind of mischief did you get into?
Oh, kids were just as mean then as they are now. The only difference was they were sneakier then because they knew who was boss. They also knew that if they got in trouble at school, they'd probably be in trouble at home. And what they did, they didn't intend to get caught at it.
What are some of the Halloween tricks you pulled?
Well, I didn't go in for Halloween tricks much. I don't remember that. Now, since I've been teaching, we've had kids that went in for all kinds of tricks. I know my daughter-in-law's telling about Halloween was a lost cause if they didn't upset so many outside Johns way back yonder years ago and that kind of stuff. But when I was a little kid, I don't know, my parents didn't condone any kind of destructive tendency.
What was Halloween like when you were a child? What did you do on Halloween?
Well, now we didn't do much on Halloween. As I say, since then, where I have been, the kids go in for this dressing up and spook outfits and that kind of stuff. But when I was a little kid, I can't remember that we did much about Halloween.
You have anything at school for Halloween? Or
What?
do anything at school for Halloween? Or?
No, I can't remember that we did.
What about Christmas?
Oh yeah, Christmas. We had Christmas programs, always had Christmas programs. And the first Christmas tree I ever remember was not an evergreen tree at all. It was an old oak tree that had the dead leaves on it that hadn't been shed yet. They cut an oak tree, and you know how oaks will hold their leaves in the winter? Well, our first Christmas tree that I remember at school was an old oak tree with dead leaves on it. And I'll never forget it because I was supposed to speak a piece. And I got up there and said my little piece, and then I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to wind it up. So I just stood there, and I remember I started crying. And I don't know why I couldn't figure out to go sit down, but I couldn't. And I remember my mama had to come up there and get me. And that was when I was just barely 6 years old. About those days, a lot, was the insects and the lack of insect control. You know, we didn't really have any effective insect repellents in those days.
What'd you do for ticks and?
We never had tick problems, but I'm telling you, we had flies till sometimes late in the evening. The flies would collect on the screens outside, and the screen would just be dark with flies, and we didn't have a thing that would really keep them off. And I remember we milked cows when I was a kid, and my dad would mix up a mixture and use a sprayer and spray the cows with it and try to thin the flies out, but it really wasn't effective. Seems like there were so many insects, mosquitoes and flies and ants and bugs and all sorts of creepy crawlies, and there really wasn't any effective way of dealing with them.
What's your favorite childhood memory?
Oh, goodness. My favorite memory. Well, one of the pleasant things I remember was going swimming in the old creek. We had to walk 1.5 miles to get there, but it was lots of fun when we made it. Kind of a neighborhood gathering place, and we would all congregate there and swim.
Did you know your grandmother?
No, I just barely remember her. She died when I was 5 years old. and I just have a very hazy memory of her. I remember when she died, and I remember seeing her a time or two. About all I remember is I told her a lie one time.
Did she know?
Did she know that I lied to her? I don't know. She started to go visit a neighbor of ours, and I tagged along. She says, "Does your mother know? Did your mother say you could go?" And I said, "Yes." Well, my mother didn't even know I was going, and I remember I lied to her.
She knew. Grandmothers always know.
In the 1920s, were you a flapper at A&M?
No, I wasn't a flapper.
Were there many flappers at A&M?
I think A&M was more conservative than some schools.
You know, it's always been that way.
I used to think it was. I read the other day that Cynthalis Diggs Berry died at Stillwater. And what I remember about Cynthalis Diggs, first of all, she was a beauty queen. And in the second place, she could play the piano with her feet. I remember that girl. We had dance classes in the basement of Gardner Hall, and Cynthalis Diggs would go up there in her gym suit and perch on that chair and get her feet up there and play a little old ditty with her toes on the piano. And that's about all I know about her, but she died just a couple of weeks ago. You know, the Berry family at Stillwater that's always been there, I guess she married one of the bunch, I don't know which one.
What's your idea of a flapper? What they look like?
Oh, we used to have them in our town. What's that song say? Roll down hose, turned up nose, and all that.
5'2",
Yeah.
eyes of blue.
All right, I can remember when they used to roll their hose down and paint their knees. Ever?
Paint their knees.
Paint their knees, yeah. Put rouge on their knees. And they could do the Charleston, and I certainly couldn't do the Charleston.
Did you bob your hair?
Yeah, I bobbed my hair about in 1923 or 4. Oh yeah, one by one, people cut their hair off.
Did you wear the short dresses?
Not really. Like I say, my parents were kind of conservative. They didn't go for this radical stuff.
That was a big change or a big decision in those days for a woman to cut her hair off, was it not? I mean,
yeah.
you know,
Oh, yeah.
because always before the women wore their hair long and, you know,
Yeah,
done up on their
yeah.
heads.
Yeah, that was a revolution. I'll tell you another revolution was when women took up smoking. I can remember the first girls that ever smoked that I know about, and I was in college in West Virginia at Marshall University. We had some in the sorority house there that smoked, and I'd never seen any smoke in Oklahoma at that time. And something else they came out with in the late 20s was hoopy socks, they called them. You know, anklets?
Oh,
Hoopy socks.
That's what they called them, hoopy socks. I was in summer school at Stillwater in 1929, I believe, and there was a little girl from Texas named Slovenhop. And she'd wear hoopy socks to class, and boy, that was daring. And all in the world it was anklets.
Did you Marcel your hair?
Yeah. Let's see, I was trying to think when we got the first Marcel job. I imagine that was about 1930.
Did you have the Marcel rubbers or what? How does that?
They did those with curling irons. You know, the first Marcels were done with curling irons.
Huh. What'd the curling iron look like?
Well, what they would do, they'd use that iron, and they had a way of manipulating it, and see it'd just go back and forth. It took a skilled person. And finger waving started in the late late 20s. They'd wet your hair and roll it up on a pencil and pin it, and that started. Yeah.
Put their fingers down.
Yeah. Yeah,
My mother used to do that.
Something else that came in the late 20s was talkies. See, we had silent movies until then. They called it Vitaphone.
What's the first talking movie you saw?
Might have been Ramona.
Oh, that's a good movie.
That was one of the first talkies I saw.
Was that Stillwater?
Yeah. I remember when Lindbergh came to Stillwater right after he made his historic flight. You know, he went across the ocean in 27 in May, and that fall he came to Stillwater.
Did he give a talk or what?
Yeah, he talked out there. You know, he never was a famous talker. I mean, he wasn't given to long-windedness, but I remember his zooming around overhead in Stillwater.
Did you get to meet him?
No, I didn't.
Who was president of the university when you were there?
Bradford Knapp. I was there before Henry G. Bennett. Bradford Knapp was there, and Henry G. Bennett came the next year, and people said he'll last 1 year.
Mm-hmm. What was Mr. Knapp like, Dr. Knapp?
Southern gentleman. I think he's from Alabama or somewhere down there, Louisiana. You know, he was the stately, white-haired sort.
Where was his office at that time?
I believe it was in Whitehurst Hall. I think the offices were at Whitehurst Hall.
What was Dr. Bennett like?
Dr. Bennett and his wife were two of the finest people I ever knew. Now they had the rare quality of remembering everybody. Now when my husband was a freshie at Stillwater, he said he got a note one day that said, "Come to President Bennett's office," and he said he's scared out of his boots. He wondered what he'd done stupid. And he went to Bennett's office, and he said, Dr. Bennett said, "Well," said, "I just wanted you to know that I was to a meeting at Apache the day before, and said I met your parents." And he just wanted to chat with him a little.
Was he and his wife both killed in that plane crash?
Yes. In Iran, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Tehran, it was close to Tehran.
That was in what, the 50s?
I think about 51, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
How did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, the strange thing was that everybody is poor, and nobody told us we were poor, so it didn't seem to bother a lot of people.
Were you married then?
My husband and I married in 1933, right at the depths of the Depression.
Where'd you meet?
Oh, I met him when I came through here with my folks visiting in this part of the country. I met him then, years before, about 1926, and then I saw him again when he was at school at Stillwater and I was teaching at Cleveland. But you're talking about the Depression. I went to an oil field school at Cleveland to teach. I taught in an oil camp there because there were a lot of these little towns that you couldn't even cash their checks when you taught. Their warrants weren't any good. So I went to an oil field school to teach because I thought they'd have more money, and I taught in an oil camp at Cleveland for 3 years.
What was it like teaching in the oil camp?
Well, my brother told me I better stop before I started because the kids had run me off because he thought, these oil field kids are so wild. They were the nicest children I was ever around. But of course, by the time I was in the oil field, the drifters had drifted on, and it was just the operating crews that were there, the pumpers and so on. And it was one of these places where they had houses on both sides of the road, and the refinery down at the end, and the school at the other end, and all the children were children of employees.
How big was the schoolhouse?
Oh, it was just a one-room school, and I taught about, I would say, maybe 25 children of employees in all grades.
Which oil company or which oil field did you?
Sinclair,
Sinclair.
and it later became Prairie Sinclair.
Did you meet Mr. Sinclair?
No, but I was on the Mullendore lease. You've heard of the Mullendore family.
Oh yeah.
Well, this was on the Mullendore lease, and the Mullendores, a bunch of them lived in Cleveland then. Old E.C. Mullendore himself, lived at Cleveland. That's where he got started making his money. There's another bunch of the Mullendores lived at Stillwater when I was there. But anyway, this was the Mullendore lease out there.
What was your favorite subject to teach?
Well, history and English, I guess. Until I got into library science, and then when I came here to the college, I taught library science courses of different kinds, and I really think I liked library science better than anything.
Now, did you teach in Cleveland before you were married?
Yes, I taught in Cleveland at the time I was married, and I went back there and taught a year after I married because we were too poor to do anything else, so I had to keep my job.
What was your salary in the Depression? What were you making?
I was making $100, and they lowered it to $75.
A month?
Yeah.
What was your husband's name?
Earl Mickley.
And where was he from?
He was from Apache. He had lived on that farm down there where his folks homesteaded. He was an agriculture major at OSU.
So after Cleveland, where did you all live?
We came down here and lived on the farm after I left Cleveland. I taught a year.
Apache?
Yeah.
That was what, 34, 35?
Now, I moved down here in the spring of 34. We married in June of 33, and I moved down here when school was out in 34.
How come you moved back down here?
Well, that's where my husband's farming business was.
How big was the farm?
His dad had 240 acres, and then he and I bought 160 acres in 1938. And then later on, we got a little more land.
When did you come to Weatherford
1962.
to teach at Southwestern?
Uh-huh.
Did you teach when you lived on the farm?
Yeah, I drove and taught all those years, and then my husband had a heart ailment, and it got worse all the time, so we decided that I'd go to OU and get my degree in library science because that's what I thought I'd like to do. And I went 5 summers and worked out a degree in library science, and when I got that, I came here to Southwestern and took a job as a reference librarian. And started out teaching one course, just general library survey course. And then they changed the school laws of Oklahoma so that the school librarians around had to have more hours of library science. So we added courses up here then. As we added courses, I taught more.
When you lived down by Apache, what did you teach?
I taught in elementary school.
Where at?
I taught at a consolidated school called Sedan, south of Mountain View, and then I taught at a place called Stecker that was out from Apache. Taught there 4 years and taught at Sedan 4 years.
Who was head of the library at OU when you went there?
What?
Who was head of the library at OU?
McAnally.
McAnally.
He died a few years ago.
What about World War II?
What I remember about it? What I remember about it is I had a brother overseas in Europe, and I remember it was so hard to find out anything about what was really going on, and we used to worry a lot about him, wondering, how his fortunes of war were coming along.
Did you organize any activities in the school? The school
No,
kids?
not particularly. We, during World War II, I didn't go back to teaching. I quit teaching in 1938, and I didn't go back to teaching till the fall of 1945. So actually, I wasn't teaching during World War II.
Was your husband farming
Yes.
during that time?
Uh-huh.
Let me regress and ask you, were you working in the oil fields in Cleveland when Governor Murray closed the oil fields?
Yeah, I was at Cleveland when Governor Murray was having his hassle.
What was all that about?
Governor Murray was prorating the oil wells, trying to get the price of oil up to $1 a barrel. Oil was so terribly cheap, and he was trying to get the price up, and the way he did it was by shutting down the wells so many days a month. I think 10 days a month. And it would have been fine, except nobody was doing it except Oklahoma, so it didn't help much. Yeah, I saw Governor Murray while I was teaching at Cleveland. He came to Cleveland when I was there.
Then when he called out the National Guard to close
The bridge down here to Texas, that was about that time.
Did he talk about that?
I don't remember he even talked about it when he came to Cleveland. What I remember about him was I thought he's the rudest old man I ever saw in my life.
How come?
Well, he was sitting on the back of a truck in a rocking chair. And people were standing all around. And some woman yelled out and says, "Why don't you stand up? We can't see you." And he says, "I don't have to."
What was he talking about?
Oh, gee, I can't remember. He was always going to plow up the grass around the Capitol and plant potatoes. I remember that.
Mercy. Wonder what kind of potatoes that'd grow.
I don't know.
Was all that fertilizer?
I was gonna say. Do you have any questions?
Yes. What branch of the service was your brother in?
is in the Air Corps. He had been in the Air Corps in peacetime back in about 1931 and 2 and along there. And then when he got ready to go into World War II, he went back into the Air Corps. He was actually in the glider service stationed in England.
I have talked to this man. Where was he stationed primarily during?
Just out of London. Actually, he worked at that place where they assembled gliders for the launching into Europe, to the mainland.
Okay, that's terrific. That's really interesting.
Any more questions that you have?
No, that's what I wanted to know because we didn't find out where he was, and I wanted to know.
Anything else about your father that you can remember?
Well, I don't think of anything that'd be of any interest to you.
I don't think of anything.
No. Well, I want to thank you.
Well,
Have a good interview.
trouble is, I didn't have any idea what you needed.
See, you just thought you couldn't tell us anything.
I don't know what you're gonna do with it now that you've
Oh,
got it.
it's wonderful.
About life in the oil field in the 30s.
You did.
Yeah,
What did he publish that in? Do you know?
he published it in the Daily Oklahoma.
That's the window in Oklahoma, wasn't it?
You know, he has a travel column there every.
Isn't that a window in Oklahoma? A window on the past? That's the name of it or something.
I think so. I think so. Window on the past?
I can't even remember what date that came out.
Well, we'll
But
find it.
anyway, he asked me to write some things about life in an oil camp in the 30s.
What were the camp houses like in those oil fields?
They were all painted gray. They were bungalows. They were not on a solid foundation because there was something about the law that if a foundation had been made a certain way, they couldn't have moved them around. In other words, if a house is built with a certain kind of foundation, it becomes a part of the land, tied to the land. And the oil companies had a way of getting around that law by having a certain kind of foundation.
Did they have running water inside the houses?
They had water at that place that came from a pond. I'm sure that the water we drank must have come from a well, but I remember the water they used for washing and that kind of thing came from a pond, and of course it was kind of muddy, and they would settle it by putting alum in the water. You know, you can put alum in dirty water and the dirt will go to the bottom and it'll be just as clear. That's the way they had of getting wash water. I remembered that.
What'd that do to the soap? Would
Well,
it still go ahead and foam?
Yeah, the soap did all right. They had a lot of torches, you know, lots of gas, so everybody had torches strewn around. They had lots of drip gasoline.
Oh, I've used drip gas.
So you know what drip gasoline
Mm-hmm.
Ever run your car in drip gasoline?
is? I never did.
I had an old junker. It wasn't good for a while. We talked about a sulfur buildup.
Oh my.
Well, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Well, we were back yonder in the early days of statehood, and he was supposed to speak at a one-room country school, and my father-in-law is the one that led him in the building.
Oh, for goodness sake.
So your father-in-law led T.P. Gore around.
Yeah, he did.
See there, that's little bits of Oklahoma history right there. And those are the things that we're after, you know. people have so many marvelous,
Oh,
interesting
yeah,
things
and
to
Alice
say.
Robertson, you know, the congresswoman from Oklahoma.
Yes.
She came to my home when I was a kid. And she came in our farmhouse, and my mother had a quilt in a frame, quilting on it, and Alice Robertson came in there, and she just had a bang-up good time playing with that quilt.
What was she like,
Alice Robertson, she was an old gray-haired lady when I first saw her, and she was campaigning with Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He was running for Congress, and they came to Haskell, which was 6 miles from our home, and she was making a political speech there, but you know, her home was close to Muskogee, and she came out there to the farm one day, and I can't imagine going out around to farmhouses campaigning, but she certainly came there.
That's fascinating. I never thought of
She
that,
came in,
that they would do that.
you know, she taught at an Indian school out in Muskogee.
That Bacon College?
No, she didn't teach at Bacon, she taught at a Presbyterian boarding school, I believe, an Indian school way back yonder.
Where's Haskell Institute? Is that?
Haskell Institute's in
It's in
Kansas.
Kansas.
Mhm. But Haskell, the
Okay,
town of Haskell.
Okay, I'm getting the town mixed up with.
There is a town called Haskell that's west of Muskogee.
Mm-hmm. I look at it on the map every day.
There is where I heard her speak first, before she ever came to our house.
So she came in and quilted with your mother?
She came in, yeah, and she was an old time, my mama was.
She was a smart lady. Knew how to get
Did
people to
Mr.
vote for her.
Roosevelt win?
Yeah, think so. I think so.
Was he
He's Teddy Jr.
was he from Oklahoma?
Oh, no. He must have just been helping her. She's running,
Yeah,
you know,
okay.
she's running for office. He must have been helping her
Yeah.
because he was with her.
Mm.
I remember when she died.
Maybe that's why they came by the farmhouse, because your father served with his father.
I don't know when they came by there. But I remember she was there. And I remember she had that stringy white hair hanging over just like mine.
Wait a minute, I got one more question that you didn't ask her.
Okay.
From the time that you started teaching till the time that you quit, how many years have you taught?
I started teaching in 1928 in the elementary country school. My last teaching was 2 years ago. I taught 5 years part-time up here at the college, taught Monday night classes. After I retired, see, I worked full-time till I was 65. And then from 65 to 70, I just taught Monday night classes. That's all I was allowed to teach and still qualify as a retiree. So 2 years ago, I quit teaching. But my total service, I believe, was 34 years full-time and 5 years part-time. But there were several years that I didn't teach. See, I have 2 children, and I took off when they were small.
I just wondered because he didn't ask, and I'm an ex-teacher myself,
Oh,
and
sure.
yes, and I just wondered. I taught theater and speech, and I was just curious.
You live in Oklahoma City or
No, I
Norman?
live at Shawnee.
Oh, you
I
do?
just work for the Historical Society
Oh, I
in the
see.
city, but I prefer a small town.
Okay. Thank you.